Okay, where we left off right before civilization ended, I remember that by 1914, you had seen a period called the New Imperialism for the previous generation. A handful of nations, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, the United States, had conquered large parts of the world. And by 1914, they had under their control about 90% of the world's population, as you can see on the map over here. And as we have seen in your previous classes, all of this happened for reasons. As these nations were the nations that went through the second industrial revolution, they became very powerful as a result, and they had a tremendous advantage over those nations that did. Right? So by 1914, they conquered the world, and within 60 years, they lost it. That is, if you look at the world today, direct imperialism is a thing of the past. Actually, as a concept, it's totally discredited. It's so discredited that in the high schools, they're not even allowed to use the word imperialism when they talk about America at this time, even though America explicitly called itself an imperialist nation. Right? That is, you saw in the 1930s a the under Mahatma Gandhi in India, a campaign against the British in India that wound up ending with Indian independence in 1947. This was followed by an independence movement against the French in Vietnam, right? Where the Vietnamese fought a war, they were able to get rid of the French. In the 1960s, this was done all over Africa. By 1975, imperialism is pretty much over with. So if imperialism occurred for reasons, then why did it fall apart? That is, why doesn't it exist anymore? And for that, I want to go over three primary reasons that are going to go into your class today. And that is the incentive structure of the imperialist nations themselves, something called imperial overstretch also, which we'll go over in a minute, and the question of what happens if the conquered peoples of the world decide, we will pay any price it takes in order to get rid of the conquerors. And so let's look at those for your class today. And let's start off with what I mean by the incentive structure. Right? That is, we've gone over a world so far where a handful of powerful nations are conquering the world. They are going through and taking over other parts of the world, okay, to serve themselves, for markets, for resources, to satisfy their populations, for their cultural needs, for their national security. There's only so much world to go around. By 1900, the world has been carved up by these handful of nations. So, what happens if your nation doesn't think it got a big enough cut? It just can't let that go. Because remember how this incentive structure is going to work. If your nation doesn't have a large enough empire, then you figure you can't get resources for your factories. You can't get markets for your products. If your nation doesn't have a big enough cut of the world, then your people are unhappy. You have ambitious men in your country who don't have room to prove themselves. And you have this overall image of social Darwinism. That is, they figure that the world is divided up into the strong and the weak, where the strong have a right and an obligation and a duty to rule, and the weak are going to get punked. So if you don't have an empire, which one of those two does that make you? It makes you one of the weak. And if you are seen as weak in the logic of imperialism, that means you're about to get conquered. So if you're a nation that didn't get a big enough cut of the world, then you can't just let that go, which means what can you do about it? You have to go through then one of the nations that does have a cut of the world and take it away from them. So what this means is that this incentive structure is inevitably going to lead these handful of conquering nations to war against each other. Because inevitably some country is going to feel insulted because they did not get a big enough cut of the world, and they are going to want to go try to get more, which is going to lead them into conflict with the nations that do control the world. And this is something that everybody as early as 1898 saw as inevitable. For example, uh, what you're looking at here is a map of something called War Plan Orange. Right? Starting in 1898, American military leaders started to create a series of contingency plans, war plans for future wars with other nations. These were color coded. There was a war plan red for a future war with Britain, a war plan brown for a future war with Germany, a war plan green for a future war with Mexico, and there was a war plan orange for a future war with Japan. Right? Why would they be thinking that they would need these types of war plans? Well, remember what was going on at this time. The United States in 1898 had conquered the Philippines. They were using the Philippines as a base to go into China. The Japanese were also one of the winners of this era. They wanted an empire of their own. Where do they want it? They wanted it in China, which means that China is like an ice cream cone and the United States and Japan are like two 5-year-olds. They are going to throw down. And they both saw it coming. And in 1940, that conflict inflected start. That was one of the major reasons behind the Second World War. And in their next class, we're going to see an even bigger example of that. What's the First World War? Germany wanted the bigger cut of the world, and they figured they had to go through the other conquering nations to get it. Eventually, these wars that are generated by imperialism are going to be hugely destructive. 19 million people are going to die in World War I. 55 million people are going to die in World War II. And eventually, this is going to make people all over the world to conclude, imperialism just isn't worth it. It isn't worth the price we're paying. If we have to go through another world war to keep an empire, then screw the empire. Right? So these destructive wars of the 20th century that are generated by imperialism are one of the things that's going to lead to its end. But even without those wars, imperialism was in trouble anyway. And this was because of a concept called imperial overstretch, which I want to explain right quick. Right? In the 1980s, there was a political scientist at Yale named Paul Kennedy. Kennedy wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Right? He wrote that book because he asked himself a question. That is, he had looked over European history over the previous 400 years. And he had seen that in Europe, you saw powerful nations rise and dominate Europe, and then almost as quickly they would fall apart. And then they would be replaced by another dominant nation that would fall apart as well. And he wanted to see if there was any pattern to this, why nations rose and fell. And what he came up with was a concept that he called imperial overstretch. The idea goes like this. You have see over here a slide of the British Empire in 1850. Britain in the late 1700s became very powerful. It did primarily because of its economy. And this is what Kennedy found throughout all the countries he looked at. Is they became powerful because they came up with some kind of a competitive economic advantage. They were able to tap into the wealth of their countries and then use that wealth in order to become superior to other nations militarily and organizationally. So Britain in the 1700s became powerful because of the Industrial Revolution. And they used that power in order to take places in the world that were useful for them. For example, they conquered India. Right? So Britain, the powerful nation, conquers India's source of resources. India provides them a lot of wealth. The end. But this means that there's ships full of stuff going from Britain to India. Ships full of stuff going from India back to Britain. So if you're a pirate, would you want to steal some of that stuff? Or if you're a nation that doesn't like Britain, maybe you can take Britain down a couple of notches by intercepting their shipping between India and the home islands. Right? So this trade between Britain and India, okay, the control of the colony is very vulnerable. So in order to defend it, you have to set up a series of bases. That is, to hold India, you have to have bases in the Indian Ocean in order to protect the ships that are coming out of India. You have to control the southern tip of Africa over here in order to protect the ships that are coming in from India. You have to have islands here in the Atlantic in order to protect the trade coming in from India. You have to have bases on the western coast of Africa. Right? You also have to, if you're going to India this way, you have to be able to have bases in the Red Sea, bases in the Mediterranean Sea, so on and so forth. None of those bases really make you any money. They cost you money, but they don't cost you a lot of money, and they're worth the price in order to protect the trade going back and forth between the colonies. That does make you money, right? But now all of those bases you have need to be protected too. That is, if you have a base on the southern tip of Africa, then that means you have to control the interior of Africa. If you control Egypt for its access to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, that means that you have to control the entire Nile River down to here to keep Egypt from being attacked. If you have bases here on the western coast of Africa, you have to control the interior behind them, or else they're going to get attacked. If you've got India, then you've got to control places like Afghanistan in order to keep India from being attacked. So the next thing you know, you have conquered now a whole bunch of places. These places, unlike India, are not economically productive to you. Right? They cost you money, but you have to hold them in order to control the valuable places. Right? This is what Kennedy described as imperial overstretch. That is, now the empire has expanded, right, just to protect itself, just to protect the valuable parts from being attacked. And you have now taken so much land that is not economically productive that now the empire, rather than enhancing the wealth of Britain, is actually spending the wealth of Britain. Because they're taking money out of their country in order to occupy places like Afghanistan, the Sudan, Uganda, right? And as such, the empire now, rather than enriching the country, is impoverishing it. Money that is going into the empire is not going into the British economy anymore. So the British economy is becoming increasingly unproductive. Other nations like Germany are putting their wealth into coming up with better factories, better technology. Britain is falling behind. And as this continues, Britain, as a result, is going to get weaker and weaker while their competitors are going to get stronger and stronger. Right? So by 1900, Britain isn't the biggest economy in the world anymore. The United States has passed it up. By 1914, it isn't the biggest economy in Europe anymore. Germany has passed it up. Right? By 1945, the empire is costing them so much money that they can't even afford to hold it anymore. So they start granting parts of it independence. Right? Then that is something that Kennedy said was inevitable. That is, if you are in a competitive world and you conquer part of it, then you have to keep on conquering in order to defend what you have, and eventually that costs so much that the empire just isn't worth it anymore. Right? And an interesting side to that, Kennedy wrote this book in the mid 1980s, and when he wrote it, he thought there were two nations in the world at that time that were on the edge of reaching the same thing. That is, that they were spending so much money by controlling large parts of the world that he was thinking it was bankrupting them rather than making them stronger. One of those nations was the Soviet Union, and in that, Paul Kennedy was spot on. He wrote the book in 1986. By 1991, the Soviet Union had completely fallen apart. That it was spending so much money occupying places like Eastern Europe that its technology had fallen behind, its economy was unproductive, and eventually the nation as a whole just completely collapsed. The other nation he was thinking of, by the way, was the United States. He thought America, by opposing the Soviet Union in the Cold War, has stretched itself so thin that it was in a lot of trouble. 30 years later, America is still going strong, but it is one of the interesting questions of the next 100 years or so. That is America overextended? Is America spending so much money, it being in so many places of the world, that it is falling behind in the things that are actually important? That is, it's losing technology, it's losing economically. And if you take this class in 30 years, somebody will give you the answer. If so, dig me up and let me know. All right, so we now have two basic problems with imperialism. That is, that the nations that are doing the conquering are going to turn on each other, and that the nations doing the conquering are going to get overextended. They're going to spend too much conquering in order to be able to keep being productive. But then we get to the third problem. And the third problem is what happens if the people who are conquered decide they're not going to take it anymore. And to see what happens there, I want to look at a specific example. The specific example is the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Okay? Mexico in 1910 was ruled by this man here. His name is Porfirio Diaz. Diaz took control of the country in 1870, and for the next 40 years, he ruled it. He's the longest serving president in Mexican history. When he ruled Mexico, he was considered friendly to outside investors like the United States. So he allowed outsiders to come in and buy Mexican property, buy valuable Mexican resources. By 1910, 57% of the real property in Mexico was owned by foreigners. Right? He also was somebody in Mexico who ruled with an iron fist. That is, he was a dictator. He had absolute control over the country. And so, because of both, he created a lot of resentment within Mexico. Right? In 1911, this is going to lead to a revolution against him. The revolution was led by this man here. His name is Francisco Madero. Francisco Madero was a landowner in northern Mexico. Right? He opposed the dictatorship of Diaz. Diaz forced him out of the country. He wound up with his brother going to exile in San Antonio. There, he organized a revolution to get rid of Diaz. He did it by cultivating the American government. That is, the first thing he did was he hired a public relations guy. This public relations guy started to pass words around Washington that Diaz was bad and that Madero was good. So as a result, the American government looked the other way while Madero bought guns in the United States and smuggled them across the border. That was technically illegal. Madero's revolution worked. He was able to overthrow Diaz, and Madero became the president of Mexico. The end. Except within Mexico, there were a lot, although Diaz was gone, a lot of his friends and henchmen were still left behind. They controlled large parts of the Mexican government. They wanted to get rid of Madero and take over again. Also, you had a lot of ambitious generals in the country who, rather than supporting Madero as president, wanted to get rid of Madero and take over for themselves. So what these guys started to do was they were cultivating the United States too. Remember this whole idea of indirect imperialism. That is, a country like the United States doesn't just can has multiple options to control another area. They can just openly go in like they did in the Philippines, put a guy in charge. I mean, put their own people in charge and just run the country directly. Or they could do what they did in Mexico. That is, just find a Mexican like Porfirio Diaz who would do what they wanted. Right? So, knowing this, a bunch of ambitious Mexican politicians went to the American government. They said that Madero was bad for American interests and that they would be good for American interests. This worked. And within 6 months, they were able to use that to be able to hold a coup of their own. They got rid of Madero. Okay, Madero wound up getting shot. The end. Except that now that Madero's gone, nobody's in charge. So all those ambitious Mexican politicians start fighting against each other. This starts a 15-year civil war in Mexico called the Mexican Revolution. It's actually a really huge war. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million Mexicans died as a result of the Civil War. And if you have ancestors who came to America from Mexico about 1910, 1920 or so, they were probably refugees from this war. That is, a lot of people wound up fleeing Mexico as a result of the war and wound up resettling here. At the time, there were no immigration restrictions between Mexico and the United States. If you were from anywhere in Latin America, you could cross the border anytime and settle in the United States anytime you wanted. Right? Anyway, so you have the Civil War going on in Mexico, where a bunch of Mexican politicians are competing to take charge. And while they were competing to take charge, they found there was one thing they could do to make themselves popular among the Mexican public as a whole. And that was they could stick it to the United States. That is, the United States by 1911, 1912 was deeply unpopular in Mexico. The Mexican public thought the Americans were ripping them off, were taking all their resources, were holding all their land, they were conquering their country. So, if you were a Mexican general and you wanted to be in charge, you could go out in the people and say you'd save Mexico from the Americans. So, you wound up with Mexican governments over the course of the Civil War that were becoming more and more anti American. And in 1916, this guy decided he was going to take his shot. His name is Francisco Villa. He's better known as Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was the commander of the Mexican army in northern Mexico in 1916. And in 1916, he took some of his soldiers and crossed the American border into Columbus, New Mexico. He shot up the town and killed eight Americans in the process. He and his guys then crossed the border again. The reason why he did this was he was hoping that if he attacked the United States would come after him. Right? And if the United States came after him, this would help him take power in Mexico. This would seem like an odd statement because the United States is a lot more powerful than Pancho Villa or Mexico as a whole, right? But let's follow his logic. Right? When he attacked the American town Columbus, New Mexico, it created the impression that he wanted. That is, throughout America, there was outrage about the Mexican bandits that crossed the border. So the United States organized an army commanded by the man you're looking at there. His name is John J. Pershing. He eventually would command American military forces in Europe during World War I the following year. We'll get to that later. So Pershing and his men gathered in El Paso, and they crossed the border to go in and capture Villa. This, by the way, was the border. One of the things you can see as you look across from El Paso to Juarez is there is no border. There are no gates, no fences, no nothing. That is, you could even take a streetcar across from Mexico into El Paso. That is, there was no immigration restrictions at all between the United States and Mexico. They only created the Border Patrol in 1924, and that was to keep European immigrants out. That is, European immigrants came into Mexico to try to get around immigration restrictions against them from coming into the United States. So the Border Patrol was actually created to stop them, not to stop Mexican nationals. There would be no restrictions on Mexicans immigrating to the United States until the 1960s. Anyway, Pershing and his men crossed the border. Right? They took on Villa's forces. And by the way, I like this picture because if any of you are Afghan veterans or Iraq veterans, you have seen this picture over and over again. Right? Anyway, so the Americans came in with a deeply superior military. They were better organized. They were better trained. They were better equipped. Right? If any Mexican force tried to get in front of them, they crushed it. But right, Villa knew northern Mexico a lot better than he did. That is, if any of you have ever been in that part of Mexico, that is some pretty rugged terrain. When the gangster El Chapo escaped from prison, that's where he went because he figured he could melt into that terrain and nobody would ever be able to find him. And that's exactly what Villa's army did. That is, they went into the Badlands of northern Mexico and dared the Americans to come in after them. The Americans, when they came after them, could take any town they wanted in Mexico. They could hold it, okay? Because there was no force that could stop them. However, they only had a limited amount of men, so they couldn't be everywhere at once. So they would go into a town, they would take it. Right? Then they would leave the town to go to another one. When they left the town, then the rebels would leave the town that was being attacked and go someplace else. And the Americans would chase after them. Then the rebels would run away again. So the American army in Mexico became like a dog chasing its tail. Okay? It could never catch up to those forces that were fighting against them. As soon as the Americans left a town, the rebels would come back into it, find anybody who was sympathetic to the United States and shoot them. They would look for any American-owned property and destroy it. Look for any American citizens and kill them. Right? And after a couple of years of this, the Americans were totally fed up with Mexico. That is, Villa was hoping that by having the Americans chase him and not catch him, that this would make him a hero in Mexico. He would be like, say, one of those Roadrunner cartoons. He'd be the Roadrunner, the Americans would be the Coyote. He wasn't able to play that for himself to become the president of Mexico, but he showed the weakness of the American occupation. Because although the Americans owned a lot of property in Mexico, right? Although the Americans had a great deal of military power, if the Mexicans were willing to keep on fighting anyway, keep taking the beating from taking on the Americans, making the country ungovernable, then there was nothing really the Americans could do about it. And the cost of occupying Mexico became so expensive that it wasn't worth whatever benefits they had by maintaining control over Mexico. Okay, so by the time you get to the 1920s, the United States is fed up. They're just looking for a way out. Ultimately, they wind up signing a deal with a political party that called the PRI, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Spanish. That's a Spanish acronym for it. The PRI said that if the Americans left, they would protect American property. So the American military forces left, and the PRI screwed the Americans. They wrote a new constitution for Mexico, which made it illegal for foreigners to own property in Mexico. That clause of the Mexican Constitution is still there today. By 1940, the PRI had confiscated the most profitable American property in Mexico. Okay, the oil industry. Standard Oil owned most of the oil industry in Mexico. The Mexican government nationalized it and put it into a government-owned company called Petrolero Mexicano, or Pemex. It's still around today. So the bottom line on this is if a nation is willing to resist, right, even if it can't win, then it's going to win. That is, it can just wear the conquerors out. There's the difference between Mexico and the Philippines. Was the Philippines was a series of islands. Since it was a series of islands, the Philippines, since it had no domestic arms making capability, had to get in guns from the outside. The American Navy was able to cut off the Philippines from the world, so the Filipinos ran out of weapons and couldn't fight anymore. In Mexico, they had plenty of guns, and in Mexico, even though their military forces couldn't drive the Americans out, they were willing to keep on fighting anyway. Ultimately, that wore the Americans down till the Americans left. And this is a pattern that's going to be repeated all over the world under imperialism. In the 1930s, Mahatma Gandhi did that in India nonviolently. That is, he just made India ungovernable. By the 1940s, the British had to leave. And 1940s and 50s, a man named Ho Chi Minh did that to the French in Vietnam. He fought a long war against them, made the country ungovernable. The French ultimately were forced to leave. In Africa, a series of revolutions broke out in the 1960s that did the same thing. And so imperialism today is something that is completely discredited, right? And is no longer a force in the world. But the end of imperialism is going to be a long, bloody process, right? It is going to start two world wars that are going to dominate the 20th century, right? And is going to wind up leading, okay, to the current system that we have today. And so what we're going to do for the rest of the next part of your class is go into this. That is, we'll look at the First World War, the Great Depression, which flowed out of the First World War, and the Second World War, which flowed out of both, right? And then after that, when we look into the last part of your class, we're going to look at what the world is going to create in order to replace imperialism. And so we'll do that in subsequent classes, but for now, that's what we have on imperialism. So if you have any questions over this, drop me a message, and we will go on to the next topic.